So welcome to my talk on establishing a self-regulation track in addiction treatment and recovery. So my disclosure of financial interest is a book that I've written on resilience, which actually will be available right outside the door after my talk, which lays out a program of developing the qualities of resilience based on a model, a 9-component model that I've developed. So what I'd like to do during this talk is look at the relationship between stress and autonomic dysregulation and how they affect craving, addiction, and relapse, and to learn and identify the factors that contribute to the reestablishment of self-regulation and reduced vulnerability to relapse. And the idea is to conceptualize a self-regulation track in recovery using a 9-component model of resilience, along with some teaching tools for working with this model. Now, I'll just take you through a little introductory comments, and I'm not going to obviously go through all the steps within the stress response, but I put this slide up simply to point out the complexity of the stress response and to point out that every single area of the brain is involved each time we engage that stress response, as well as pointing out that every single part of the body as well gets involved. Numerous physiological systems are activated, and then other physiological systems are inhibited during the stress response. In addition to what we commonly think of as the fight or flight response, there's also been identified a more primitive polyvagal involvement of a freeze or immobilization response, and this occurs when there's no opportunity for escape of imminent danger. And the result of this is a freeze or immobilization, which is actually a more primitive type of survival mechanism. You think of playing possum, you think of a possum when it's cornered and trapped, say, by a fox. It will go into this fugue state that looks, for all intents and purposes, as if it's dead. And it serves two functions. One, if that animal does get attacked, it doesn't feel the pain of that attack. But also, in many cases, because it appears to be dead, the predator will lose interest and actually walk away without attacking the animal. And thus, a few minutes later, the animal comes out of its fugue state, shakes off that energy, and walks away. The consequence of our traumatic experiences that are similar, one of the consequences is that survival energy doesn't have the opportunity to be released and so gets trapped in the body along with that freeze response. The consequences include PTSD as well as a learned helplessness that can carry into adult life. And finally, there's the concept of neuroception developed by Stephen Porges, which actually identifies a process in which the nervous system becomes hypersensitized. And this occurs outside of our awareness, where the nervous system actually acts as this advanced radar system for any sign of danger, which actually triggers this immobilization response. Now, this is a typical cell we find in our body. You could see, even though it's a single cell, how complicated it is. But I put it up here to highlight the fact that a cell has sort of two choices. It can go into a defense posture or a growth posture. So if you take a bunch of cells and put them in a petri dish with some nutrients so that it stays alive, and you drop a little toxin into that petri dish, the membranes of each of these cells will close down. And they close down to protect the cell and block the toxin from entering. When that happens, however, it also blocks the nutrients from entering, and all the energy of that cell is going into that protective mode. When that happens, no development or healing takes place in that cell, and we can think of ourselves as organisms that have those same two choices between protection, defense, or healing, growth, development. And of course, when there's a danger, when there's a stress, the body puts its energy into that defensive protective mode. And we're all challenged by the imbalance of the situations and stimuli in our lives that trigger the stress response, that trigger danger, uncertainty, versus the stimuli in our lives, in our environment, that may trigger the opposite, the recuperation response. So we have a nervous system that has two branches, the sympathetic that responds to danger, mobilizes us, activates us, and the parasympathetic, which helps us recover, helps us restore the resources that are used up. And these two need to be in balance. However, how many stimuli in your daily life, in your environment, trigger the stress response? Quite a few, perhaps on a continual basis throughout the day. But how many stimuli in your life and your environment trigger that opposite, trigger recuperation, trigger, it's safe, I can let down my guard? So for all of us, there is an imbalance, and this actually is the source of many different kinds of diseases. Now, in addition, we have what I refer to as an evolutionary defense bias. So if survival is the most important thing for any species, there's going to be a bias in the defense protective mode. So there's this bias that we begin with between these two sides. And then we have all of these psychological factors that add to this imbalance. The need to be liked, the need to be perfect, difficulty saying no, fear of rejection, as well as our diminished capacity or self-confidence, which further accentuates this imbalance. Now, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, while they had it difficult in life, one thing that wasn't confusing was what was causing danger and stress. It was life-threatening. Today, however, it's very different. It's, will I be liked? Am I being judged? Can I pay my bills? Will I keep my job? Is my friend mad at me? Will I get the latest iPhone? So what is the common denominator of today's stresses? Okay. There's two that stand out as most important. One is none of these are really life-threatening, and two, they are all subjective. Now, on top of this, there's what I refer to as an evolutionary mismatch between the environment in which we developed this stress response, which was a hunter-gatherer environment, and today's environment. So we prepare for danger the same way that caveman prepared, with the fight or flight response. However, again, how many of the situations in your life can be solved by either fighting the danger or running from the danger? Very few. So that mobilization occurs, but then there's no release. Again, further accentuating the imbalance. Now, There are many reasons why we actually have resistance to managing the stresses that we encounter. First of all, our stress response mobilizes the body's resources, and so within limits, it actually enhances performance. It helps us be more aware, it helps us be more focused, more motivated. So within certain limits, it's something that's very good and positive. It's adaptive. It's a survival mechanism, and again, we are really loath to begin to try and control something that has survival implications. Many people feel like there's a slippery slope. If I start to let down my guard, I might get lazy, who knows what can happen, I might lose my job, I might lose my relationship. Now, one thing that's very interesting, if you think about all the successes in your life, you'll probably realize that most of them were accompanied by stress. And so over our lifetimes, we've made this connection between stress and success. So again, it further reinforces the triggering of the stress response, the going into the stress response. Now, in addition, stress and the stress response and preoccupation with stress actually masks emotional pain and other uncomfortable feelings. So, for example, when I do biofeedback with a client, I can begin taking them into deeper states of calm. And one of the ways we do this is we monitor skin conductance, which is a measure of the activation of the nervous system. And we use a tone to indicate that that level of calmness is increasing or the level of tension is decreasing, and the tone will start coming down. But it's interesting what might happen in many cases is as you get to a certain level, suddenly the tone will bounce back up. Okay, you continue with that process and you help the person relax again, that tone comes down, and then at almost the very identical spot, it will bounce back up again. And when you start to check in with the client, okay, what's going on there? Invariably, they will tell you that they started to get uncomfortable and their body activated almost automatically. And what's going on is that as they quiet their nervous system, their feelings that they've pushed down or somehow ignored start to come up to the surface, making them uncomfortable, and then they activate to move away from those feelings. So one of the things that happens to all of us is that as we start to get into that deeper place of comfort, which is very important for recovery, it does tend to become uncomfortable and we move away from that process. When we push down our feelings enough, one of the consequences can be depression, and with depression is a sort of a deadness. And so for some people, triggering the stress response and triggering the release of adrenaline actually is the one way that we can feel alive. So again, more resistance to controlling the stress response. Unfinished business, the need to be liked, the need to be successful, all the kinds of things that we didn't get growing up can motivate and can drive additional stressful behavior. This works fast. Okay. We also habituate to higher and higher levels of tension, and thus, even though our bodies are showing signs of tension, because it happens on such a gradual basis, we slowly adapt to it and don't realize. So, for example, most of us will be sitting here right now thinking we're pretty calm, pretty relaxed, but if I took a biofeedback monitor and monitored muscle tension in some of your muscles, like your shoulders, we would see significantly elevated levels of tension. but we don't necessarily notice this until it starts to create pain. And there's discomfort, as I said before, with being vulnerable. It's dangerous to be vulnerable, or we learned in our childhood it could be dangerous. And then finally, again, there's the dominance of the sympathetic branch of our nervous system. So when you're vulnerable, people are sort of, being vulnerable is dangerous. Okay, letting down your guard is dangerous. And so when you keep your guard up, it makes it more difficult to let go and relax. Now, many people, including many of us, are willing to give up some of our health, some of our physiological comfort, because it's so important to be productive. It's so important to perform. Well, what I'm showing here in this graph is that while a certain level of arousal or stress does improve performance, you will see that there's a point at which that performance starts to drop off. And this could be in an individual situation where too much stress will impair performance, or it could be over time where cumulative stress begins to impair performance. And we could see this if we look at our brain, we could see it if we look at our behavior, if we look at reaction times. There are a number of different physiological and behavioral measures that show this particular decrement as we increase stress, increase arousal. Now you'll notice that I have two different curves here, and what I'm showing, curve B, is someone who is resilient. So someone who's resilient will still have that same pattern, but you will see that they can push their level of stress, level of arousal further before there's this drop in performance. So we're all crying out, but we don't want to listen. And here's one executive saying to another, saying, I save a lot of time by not unwinding. And the consequence is impairment of self-regulation, ability to self-regulate. And now let's look at this with regard to addiction, because early stress creates a greater vulnerability to addiction. It causes brain impairment of systems involved in self-regulation and brain impairment of systems involved in reward mechanisms as well. So a childhood that's stressful, unsafe, or traumatic leads to damage and permanent alteration and vulnerability to brain and to function. Primitive Gestalt patterns is a concept I've developed that addresses how the brain develops based on the childhood environment. So it's not only important to realize how the learning occurs to childhood lessons, but it's also important to realize that the brain itself develops based on that childhood environment. And so circuitry that gets rewarded and reinforced and thus survives through childhood is the circuitry based on the lessons of that childhood environment. So we as children don't go out and sample hundreds of different families to see what's a healthy, normal way of being. We adapt to our particular little world that we grow up in, and then our brain literally forms based on those lessons. And thus there's continual negative or danger expectancy and the continual triggering of the stress response, along with a lack of self-efficacy, again, based on childhood lessons. And so there's a disparity between perceived demand versus perceived resources. And you want resources and demand to be in balance. So more specifically, there's an impairment in the development of the prefrontal cortex. And I know there have been a lot of talks over the last couple of days talking about the importance of the prefrontal cortex. But specifically with regard to self-regulation, there's an impairment in the right prefrontal cortex, which plays an important role in activating and regulating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, as well as the autonomic stress response. It's also important in emotional regulation, and we know that toxic stress decreases the neural connections of the prefrontal cortex. The result is a lifelong impact where there's a hypersensitivity of the hypothalamus and the amygdala. There's a hyperreactivity of the motor system. There's sympathetic hyperarousal and reactivity, so there's an on-guard, can't relax or recuperate type of approach to the world. So it's a nervous system that doesn't turn off or return to baseline, which further accentuates this notion of impairment of self-regulation. And as we know, this fosters one of the issues that our clients deal with, which is a difficulty feeling a sense of home in their own bodies. So I'd like to talk about these two opposing forces that we deal with. On the one hand, as we've been learning more and more, there's this amazing ability of the brain for neurogenesis and new brain cell growth and development. And this is a very optimistic concept, because it tells us that there's the continual ability of the brain to adapt, to adjust, and to grow and to heal. Juxtaposed to this concept is what I've been referring to as primitive gestalts, or fixed patterning based on the lessons of childhood. So what I'm suggesting is that we literally, our ability to adapt freezes to our childhood environment. And so it's very important to realize that we have this kind of freezing of adaptability as opposed to this notion of neurogenesis. So we can think about how one of the reasons that makes our brain have the ability to be as complex as it is that all the things that we learn very quickly get formed into habit patterns, procedural memories. So that's what allows me to walk across this room and talk at the same time. I don't have to think about every muscle that I have to move in this ability to walk. But this ability to immediately transform learning into habit patterns actually impairs our ability of awareness and our ability to change habit patterns. So our brain jealously guards old patterns and blocks awareness. So in light of this, I want to talk about a particular area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is right over here, because there are three functions of the hippocampus that are very important with regard to this conversation. So one of the functions of the hippocampus is that it actually modulates autonomic function. And as soon as the stress response is engaged, the hippocampus sort of goes into action to put a braking mechanism on the stress response. It helps us chill out. Well, chronic stress has been shown to create atrophy and dysfunction of the hippocampus, and thus it impairs the brain's ability to dampen the stress response. In addition, the hippocampus is a main area where neurogenesis occurs. So chronic stress, again, significantly reduces the hippocampus's ability to create new nerve cells. And in addition, research has shown that excessive alcohol intake and binge drinking literally decreases hippocampal neurogenesis via decreases in neural stem cell proliferation and the survival of newborn cells. Interestingly, at the same time, it increases certain gene expression in the amygdala. So here we can see that, I know this is small, but if we're looking at actually morphological slides show that alcohol actually produces a decrease in dendritic nodes, in dendritic endings, as well as the length of apical dendrites. So these are actual morphology of brain cells of rats that are exposed to alcohol intake. Okay, so the third area of hippocampal function, which is very important to this discussion, is its role in the release of dopamine. So chronic stress has been shown to impair the neuronal integrity of the hippocampus, and as a result, there's a reduced ability to release dopamine. Now, if we just looked with regard to dopamine, with regard to the experience of pain, one of the interesting functions of dopamine is that it enhances or facilitates the functioning, the effect of endogenous opiate action. So when you experience pain and the brain releases endogenous opiates, one of the things that makes that most effective is the simultaneous release of dopamine. So dopamine actually modulates the endogenous opiates. In fact, I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of pain patients who go to the doctor for pain medication and the doctor gives them a certain dose and the patient says this is not working, one of the reasons is that they don't have the appropriate dopamine mechanism that is facilitating the effectiveness of the pain medication. And secondly, dopamine is involved in thalamic gating. So the thalamus is a sort of like a way station for sensory information. It gates that sensory information through the dopaminergic system. And so when you don't have that working as well, people experience stimuli to a much greater degree. There's a much greater reaction to the stimuli because they don't have the same gating mechanism. So there's research that shows an inverse correlation between the neuronal integrity of the hippocampus and symptoms of fibromyalgia, such as pain, fatigue, and stiffness. And fibromyalgia patients have been shown to have less gray matter in the hippocampus. Okay. So this is very relevant when we start looking at addiction related to pain medications. Now, another interesting fact here is that while stress has been shown to increase our vulnerability to relapse, cortisol, which is released during stress, increases the release of dopamine. So think about it. Where we have clients who are whose dopaminergic systems are not functioning optimally and are thus looking for ways to increase the release of dopamine. And one of the things that actually does that is stress. So the very thing that can trigger relapse at the same time in certain situations can facilitate the release of dopamine. So you have this kind of conflict situation with regard to cortisol, stress, and the release of dopamine. And finally, Early stressful experience has been shown to produce permanent, lifelong reductions of the serotonergic system, which is very, very important in emotional self-regulation. And so just to kind of summarize some animal studies, various kinds of stress, including exposure to aggressive animals in their cages, results in faster acquisition and higher rates of cocaine self-administration, also shown to increase opioid and alcohol self-administration. And then in rats where drug behavior has been extinguished, like heroin, a single stressful experience can trigger drug readministration. So the research shows that stress has a dramatic effect on drug self-administration and resumption of drug use. Very early life events, including prenatal, results in increased propensity to develop amphetamine self-administration. So this is observed in adult rats whose mothers had been submitted to stress. So again, in humans, it's been shown stress exposure enhances self-administration. We saw an increase in street drug use after 9/11. In adolescents experiencing high recent negative life events show increased levels of drug use. And we can look at the cumulative number of stressful events, and this is shown to have a direct relationship to and prediction of alcohol and drug dependence in a dose-dependent manner. So one way of conceptualizing this is that life's challenges cause a stress buildup, which is magnified by the addict's thought process and negative expectancy. Now, also because they have difficulty tolerating affect and have a difficulty in their ability to relax, there's also a failure to act or an overreaction to stressful situations. And this can perpetuate these stressful situations. They certainly don't resolve them. And stress and fear can shut down the brain. And more specifically, what stress and fear does is interferes with the functioning of the cortex and prefrontal cortex. So the person resorts to dominance of the lower centers of the brain, the more primitive centers of the brain, the survival level, the emotional level of the brain, because there's also a disconnect with the cortex. And when this happens, there's regression to old learned behavior, increasing craving, and drug preoccupation, which leads to the old behavior of drug use. Let me switch here for a moment to look at what happens in the brain with stress, which also happens with addiction. And let's see. Okay, there's a button here somewhere. To animate this. Oh, there it is. Okay. Whoop. We'll try this again. Yeah. My stress level was tested yesterday at I live in Topanga, and I heard halfway through the day yesterday of fires near our home and hearing about all the different zones within Topanga being evacuated, and I'm 120 miles away here. All right, okay. So what I want to show you here, if I had this animated, you'd see the raw EEG going across the top here. And what I've done here is been able to separate out the EEG according to its frequencies, from very slow frequency all the way up to faster frequencies, from 1 cycle per second all the way up to about 40 cycles per second. And if I had this animated, you'd be able to see over here the frequencies across time that show how the EEG of an addict, and as well as an EEG of someone that's had significant stress during childhood and trauma during childhood, have an imbalance in their frequency distribution. So all the frequencies in our EEG are important and serve certain functions, but you want to, number one, be able to shift patterns based on activity. So when you are relaxing, you want to be able to produce more alpha waves, which help you relax. And when you're doing focused attention activities, you want to produce more of the low beta waves. So these green, blue is alpha, and these yellows and just dark blue over here are the low beta frequencies. And so based on what you're doing, you want to be able to produce certain frequencies. The very slowest, delta, are more prevalent during sleep. Well, what we find with addicts is that there's an excessive level of slow wave activity, and there's excessive amounts of high beta frequency activity here, and that they're sort of locked into those patterns. Well, we'll move on. So alcoholics, for example, show elevated high beta frequencies in the mid-20s. And the interesting thing is that's also found in non-alcoholics with a family history of alcoholism. There's a similar pattern found in abstinent heroin addicts. And we know that patients with a more pronounced frontal hyperarousal, so hyperarousal is more of these high-frequency beta activity, show a worse prognosis. Now, alcoholics show a decrease in ability to produce alpha waves. That's a brainwave frequency, as I pointed out before, that is a neutral state for the brain. It's it's an alert but calm state. Alcoholics have a difficult time producing those brain waves, but ironically, alcohol in small doses produces alpha synchrony. So it's sort of understanding why alcoholics who have this difficulty producing alpha waves would be drawn toward alcohol, which in low doses produces that alpha synchrony. Cocaine addiction also causes increased high beta activity, along with elevated frontal alpha. So that's excessive alpha in the prefrontal cortex. The elevated high beta is also correlated with relapse in cocaine abuse. Methamphetamine is shown to show significant increases in slow wave activity, both delta and theta. So delta is about 1 to 4 cycles per second, again, prevalent during sleep. Theta is right above that, 4 to 8 cycles per second. When we look at the brain waves of a good percentage of people with attention deficit disorder, we see excessive theta activity, making it difficult to focus and to concentrate. Now, chronic marijuana use results in elevation of frontal alpha, referred to as alpha hyperfrontality, which affects certain cognitive functions. Now, the other interesting thing is, with chronic marijuana use, there's a reduction of alpha mean frequency, meaning within the alpha range, the optimal mean frequency is lowered. We also see that very same pattern with aging. So as the brain loses some of its cognitive abilities with aging, we see this lowering of mean peak alpha frequency, and we see that with chronic marijuana use. So with frontal alpha, there's an impairment of executive function. With excessive fast beta, there's agitation, emotional and physical tension, difficulty relaxing or feeling at home in one's body. Excessive theta and or delta impairs attention and presence. And these abnormalities make subjects more susceptible both to addiction and to relapse. Covered that already. So, what I'd like to introduce is a way of really focusing a perspective on the process of recovery that looks specifically at the restoration of self-regulation, optimal self-regulation, which I would suggest improves the brain's ability for neurogenesis and optimal adaptability or learning. So a lot of times people talk about resilience in terms of the ability to bounce back. So it's the ability to recover after stressful events. And that's true, but that's sort of like a narrow perspective on resilience. Because if you're somebody who, because of emotional wounding, keeps getting into stressful situations, even though you may be able to bounce back, over time, that ability is going to be lost because you're putting too much of a strain on the sympathetic-parasympathetic balance. So resilience is not just the ability to bounce back in the moment, not just the ability to deal with stress in the moment, but it's also long-term maintenance of optimal functioning. And so what I suggest is it's the optimal management of psychic and physical energy. So you don't want to use too much more energy for a particular circumstance than you need, because we don't have an unlimited amount of this psychic or physical energy. And this is a model that I've developed that addresses this comprehensive view of resilience. So there are three areas: relationship with self, relationship with others, and relationship with something greater. Organismic balance and mastery is physical, mental or cognitive, and emotional. And the last grouping is process, which is presence, flexibility, and the last component, power, or the ability to get things done. Now, there's a handout in which, so I've developed an assessment, the 40-item questionnaire assessment, along my 9 dimensions. And you each have those questions, and you each have this profile, and so you can score yourself on each of the 9 components, and then you can plot your scores on this profile and see which are your areas of strength and which are your areas needing further development, which brings up an interesting aspect about resilience. Many people talk about resilience as a characteristic, like you either have it or you don't have it, or it's all or nothing. And it's really important to look at these components of resilience as qualities that can be developed, qualities that can be grown based on learning and training.